Hey everyone, it's Amanda Radke back for another episode of the Heart of Rural America. I'm excited to be joined today by my dear friend Sara Steever, who, Sara, we go back probably almost 20 years. But just to kick off the show, you're from Lenox, South Dakota. You are a retired chief technology officer, but you do so many things. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the topic of the day?
Sure. Well, I live actually on the land that's been in my husband's family since 1892. So, been a South Dakotan my whole life. Where we live, we have very deep roots. Our family is here. My son and his wife live next door on the farm. I'm very, very much established in South Dakota and love what I do here. But I ended up an artist and a designer and then a web developer and had leadership roles in various places on several boards. And I really spent quite a bit of time as an advocate for agriculture, and that's where kind of you and I crossed paths. I also have a technical background. I'm very interested in what's happening in AI, and you can't be interested in AI without being interested in what's happening with data centers. That's kind of what has brought me to this topic that we're going to talk about today.
Being an advocate for agriculture, which I've spent my career doing, it's kind of evolved in recent years where it's almost like before it felt like we're out promoting the great things that farmers and ranchers are doing and talking to consumers and debunking misconceptions and promoting agriculture. And it almost in the last 5 years, I guess, would you say, really, you and I have really been involved in more of just fighting to keep farmers on the land at all. And it seems like shifted to property rights where it's being able to own and manage your land and your livestock as you see fit without somebody else coming and bulldozing over your property. And so you and I have spent a lot of time at the state capitol fighting for these issues, but it's been happening in your backyard. You've had a proposed carbon pipeline, a prison, solar panels, and data centers. I mean, you've had the bulk of it coming your way. And as a result, you've kind of become the expert in the arena. And that's why I wanted you on the show today. Like Sara said, she's been involved in AI in her work, in her career, but now also has been deeply gotten involved in learning more about these data centers, especially as they potentially could come to the state of South Dakota. And so, Sara, today I wanted to go just kind of deep dive into these data centers. There seems like there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of rumors circulating, but you are a truth seeker, as am I. And I wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of what these data centers are. So, I guess just to start, what are you hearing? What are they talking about in relation to data centers, and what are people most concerned about?
Sure. Well, I have been talking to quite a few people about it, and I've actually sought out a lot of experts in the field, a lot of like IT people, people who work in data centers. And just when you have conversations with, I'll say, regular people like me who aren't familiar with it, but they're hearing things, they're definitely concerned. They're concerned about what they don't know. And in the large part, when they start out, they're kind of lumping data centers all as one thing, like they're all alike, and they're not all alike. The size of the data center has a lot to do with, I guess, how concerned you should be about it. When I was testifying up in Pierre, I heard a legislator say, and I heard lobbyists say this too, you drive by data centers all the time, you don't even know it. That is true, actually. There are data centers that are small enough that you're not going to notice them. You might actually have a server closet in the business that you work in your hospital or your bank, or there may be those types of data centers that could qualify. But really what we're talking about and what has caused so much concern for people are hyperscale. So hyperscale can actually be as small as a 10 megawatt. Likely it wouldn't quite be that small for an AI optimized data center. But the ones that are typically being proposed that are really quite big, usually 300, 400, 500 megawatts, and then they expand. Once they get a footprint established, they'll expand, and they may even start smaller than that and get their foot in the door and then build off of that. But it's really those large ones that have a lot of rack density, that are using GPUs instead of CPUs. And there's a lot of technical jargon that I'm also always trying to stay on top of, that are housed there. And those are the things that consume a lot of energy and take a lot of our resources, water resources and things like that. So that's really what people, I think, are most concerned about, is like those resources are troubling to them. Or what is this AI, and didn't it just steal everybody's original work? A lot of people are concerned about that. And then a lot of young people are really concerned about losing their jobs because they're hearing through the not very well communicated things from CEOs from the AI companies that they're going to be replacing all of essentially the laptop jobs are going to go away because AI is going to replace them. And so you get a lot of hopeless feelings from people who are graduating college or who are just trying to figure out in high school their career path. So those are really the things I'm hearing about most. Energy use, what's going to happen to my job, and did they just steal all the original work? That doesn't seem right. So,
No, and I share those concerns, and the majority of people do. There was as reported in South Dakota Newswatch today, a poll was done by Newswatch and the Cheeseman Center for Democracy. They surveyed 500 registered voters in South Dakota. They asked these voters, should there be limits placed on data centers? And overall, statewide, 57% said yes, and 20% said no. 23% were unsure. And of course, it's common sense would tell you that that would probably align. And yet, I think the quote that said is in this article by one of the individuals that was a part of the poll. He said, people don't like data centers. I've been pulling this all over the country. I've seen these numbers before. It's just one of those unknowns where it's like from the surveillance to the taking away critical thinking and original ideas of people to those important resources. When you hear these proponents talking about it, it's one of those things where it sounds like Santa Claus has arrived and it's all sunshine and rainbows. And there's certainly uses for AI to make our lives better. But I always say the devil's in the details on this. And that's what I wanted to ask you about. So, maybe let's just get into the nitty gritty. Can you tell us about how much energy, like looking at energy use, how much do data centers really need?
I'm just going to use Sioux Falls as an example because there's a proposed hyperscale data center. Well, there's a proposed 500 megawatt data center. Whether or not it's considered a hyperscale, I would put it in that category, but there's a proposed one. So 500 megawatts is enough electricity. It's more than enough electricity for all the households in South Dakota. So to think about that amount of energy going into one location in one spot, it is just massive. And I think even though we're making good faith efforts, and I believe the energy companies are doing this, I think our legislators, they were also working towards putting together a way where consumers aren't paying for the increases in electricity prices based on the fact that there's these large load customers coming in. But the fact that these massive data centers have been being built out for as long as they have, years and years, in specific pockets like Virginia, Ohio is another one. The general pressure on electricity, just because of the way the grid works, has meant that our costs are going up just because there's just more demand. It's a real simple supply and demand. So in order to keep that down, we're going to have to artificially figure out a way to do that. And people are hopeful for that, but it is a ton of electricity. It does put pressure on a grid that we've all heard for years is not super duper stable. Electricity just went out in my little community of Lenox this last Saturday. And honestly, that was the thing everybody talked about in church on Sunday. Did your electricity go out? So we take it for granted until we don't have it. And almost everyone has said, my electric bill is going up already. I'm like, well, yes, that's going to continue to happen, partly because to build, even if we didn't add hyperscale data centers to it, we're still taking more and more electricity. We just are using more, just the way technology goes. EVs, right? We're bringing in vehicles that are electric. We're doing a lot of things that require more electricity. So the price pressure has already been put on that. The cost to build a kilowatt of new generation used to be about $800, and now it's like $2,700. Wow. So imagine the price, and that's almost like a historic fact now. And so the price of this is going to be going up no matter what. So these data centers do put a tremendous amount of energy on it. To give you an example, an ethanol plant probably is using around the 7 to 15 megawatts. So look how big an ethanol plant is, and some of them create their own energy. So they're not necessarily adding demand into the grid the way some other things are, but definitely 500 megawatt, that's massive. That's a massive amount of energy and electricity.
And so we hear a lot about water use as well. I mean, I know that there are different types of data centers that have different, if they're a closed loop versus the alternative. Can you talk about the water a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of misinformation is out there. And I think it's sometimes in the data center development presentations, they're not going to talk about actually what I would call the iceberg effect of how this actually works. So there's the water that you use on site, and then there's the water that's used off site. So on site water is going to be for example, in older data centers, evaporative cooling. So that's where you would have millions of gallons of water a year, really kind of an appalling amount of water usage. So they started developing better ways to do that, and that's closed loop technology. Well, closed loop still uses quite a bit of water. So we'll use another tangible example, which is the Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin data center that's 450 megawatts. So Microsoft has really, that one just is launching this year. So they take a couple of years to build. So Microsoft just is launching this, and they're very, very proud, and they're touting this as a zero use water. Well, zero use, meh, it's sort of zero use. You still need to charge the system, and that can be a lot of water up front. But they claim that that's saving 24, 25 million gallons a year by using this system, but it still uses 350,000 gallons a day between May and September when it's really warm. So one of the reasons why they want data centers up north is because we have cold winters. And so that helps them save some of their water usage for cooling. But the real truth of the matter is most of the energy is used in creating the type of energy they use. So we talked about how much energy they use. They need dispatchable energy. So dispatchable energy is coal and gas, nuclear, things that you can control and turn off and on. Maybe it's a diesel generator or a natural gas generator too. Some of the things you can control. The things you can't control necessarily are wind and solar. Cloudy days, when it's not windy. In South Dakota, it's always windy, but when it isn't windy, you have less control over that, and that's intermittent energy. So you can't just rely on intermittent energy. You can have it in the mix, but you still need dispatchable energy. Well, dispatchable energy takes a lot of water. So anywhere from 92% to 75% of the water usage for a data center is actually in the type of energy that it's requiring. So that's that iceberg where that offsite water usage is really the culprit. And it doesn't matter if it's evaporative cooling, in fact, evaporative or closed loop. In fact, closed loop takes more energy to run than an evaporative. So in reality, you're probably using more overall water through a closed loop just because most of the water comes from offsite. The reason why nobody talks about that, I think, when data center developers come in is because it's really an abstraction, because it's happening somewhere, wherever that coal's being mined, wherever the natural gas, gasification plants, or wherever the energy is being created, that's where that's actually happening, where that water use happens. And so, but if you think about it holistically, really, that's the water use secret. So it doesn't matter that it's closed loop, in my estimation. You just don't feel it directly.
That makes sense. And I'm just like putting it in perspective to hearing, presentations by data center companies and how they phrase things so that it looks like it's not really that much of an impact. But unpacking it tells a little different story. And so, on that note, you and I have both sat in those types of presentations. We've also spent time in Pierre at the Capitol, where some of these economic development type legislators, where they believe running the government like a business using your taxpayer dollars to pick winners and losers in agriculture and business is kind of like the only way to prosperity in the state of South Dakota. And anyone who would ask questions is deemed as anti. I was listening to a podcast today, actually, with one of those types of politicians, and he claimed the only way we can solve the property tax issue and bring prosperity to South Dakota is bring these big businesses in. And so it seems like data centers are now the new shiny objects that they want to bring to the state of South Dakota. That's what's going to save us. But what are the actual economic impacts of data centers? Is it going to be the thing that saves the state of South Dakota?
I'll just throw in a couple examples. First, I'll start with the Sioux Falls one, because there was an article that came out last summer that said there'd be somewhere between 50 and 500 permanent jobs for the Sioux Falls plant that Jim and I family was going to bring in. So that sounds like a big range, right? 50 to 500. Can we kind of narrow this in a little bit?
Right.
Let's say maybe it's in the middle. Let's say it's 250. When I got up to testify for the Sioux Falls Council, I said, well, who actually guarantees that those are DSU grads? Because that's what we'd like to hope. We've got all these really bright kids coming out of our schools here in South Dakota. Are they going to hire DSU grads? Are they going to hire SDSU grads? Computer science down at USD? Is that where these kids are going to come from, or these employees are going to come from? What's the guarantee? Who actually follows up to make sure that's the case? Or is it going to be remote workers? And actually, will it be H-1Bs because they're less expensive? We have no vehicle to guarantee after the fact that that's actually what happens. And that's one of the challenges I had with what was going on up in Sioux Falls. Like, it sounds really good, except 50 to 500, that seems really like you don't actually know what you're talking about, because that's too broad of a range. And then we
Right.
have no guarantee. We have no guarantee that those are going to be our people that end up, benefiting from those jobs. And I think if you look at what's happening up at Ellendale, so there's no place to stay up in Ellendale during this massive construction project. And I know you had the privilege of driving up there and seeing what that looks like, but I believe, at least what Applied Digital told when I went to the state township meeting, what Applied Digital said was, well, actually, everybody's driving down to Aberdeen to stay. And so they're eating in the restaurants in Aberdeen, they're staying in the hotels in Aberdeen.
Sure.
Like, I wonder what North Dakota thinks about that. Because I'm guessing that might not be what Ellendale thought they signed up for. So there's definitely a flurry of activity at the beginning during construction. And that can take a year and a half, 2 years, depending on the scale of it. And maybe it's an ongoing thing if you're building out a campus. So these campuses are just massive. So that's probably a legitimate thing. But the long-term, high-paying, full-time technical jobs, a lot of times they're a technician just changing out racks. They're not necessarily a PhD who's sitting in a windowless concrete bunker staring at these machines all the time. Maybe it's maintenance people, maybe it's, security, things like that, definitely security jobs, but they're not that many jobs. And so the people in the industry that I talk to are like, yeah, it's not even 50. You'd have to be hard pressed to say it's actually 50. And a lot of them are remote jobs. When these data center developer companies come in and they want something from the community, a TIF or a tax break or something, and we want to be competitive. I get that piece of it, but we've got to have some protections in place to say, we're going to follow up and see who you're actually hiring, and that you're actually hiring our people. If you think about Oneida, South Dakota as an example, because Big Wad is there, that's a different type of facilities because it's kind of small, isolated, what look like shipping containers. I actually drove up there and looked at it. That's not necessarily a great big room where you've got a lot of people working either, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to hire 50 people from Oneida who had a technical background. And so you'd have to have them moving in, is a community ready for that. If you think of Toronto, South Dakota, where Applied Digital was hoping to be part of, that's a lot of people to come into a community all at once. Like, where are they going to live? And I get pictures of Williston, North Dakota, kind of the boom and bust that happened up there. Do we boom and bust our little communities in the name of economic development that's very short term? And then, maybe a data center that only needed 10 people would be the right size after the fact, but still, are those the right, do they have the right people living in that area? Or do they end up with hiring one security guard and everyone else is remote? What's troubling about it is that there's a lot of information, but there's no guarantees, and there's no one who follows up afterwards to say, did we actually make a good investment with our tax dollars?
Right. Right. And I think in conversations that you and I have had, I know you had mentioned to me that it seems like there's this effort to bring them in with brute force without considering, like, will these big, huge data centers be outdated in 10 years? Will there be something that's more efficient and more to scale? Or, you and I being involved in agriculture, if you're choosing a data center, then maybe you're saying no to opportunities that would help family farms and ranches, like a new crush plant or an agricultural or a manufacturing of something that would keep families in those communities or support the families that are already there. I have to make mention of this because I think you do a great job of asking these questions and being objective, that you're looking for the answers, not necessarily, you're not against everything. You are trying to understand because you're invested in the community and you want to be a part of shaping your community in a positive way for generations to come. And yet, our Congressman Dusty Johnson last summer in a speech at the Sioux Falls Chamber of Commerce event stated that people like you and I that just want to have these reasonable conversations about what are the pros and cons of things like data centers or CO2 pipelines. He says it's, and I quote, "It's un-American and it's not at all capitalist. Forget the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. We've got bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. It is a disease, and that's metastasizing." And I find it notable that, of course, Congressman Johnson is running for governor, and this is what he thinks about the people of South Dakota who simply want to be a part of the conversation. So I guess to address Dusty's comments, What are you actually most concerned about? Because I know for a fact you are not at all anti American or anti capitalism.
I love this country. I love this state. I love my little community. I love entrepreneurs. I love free markets. I love things that are at least sort of a level playing field. And I'm going to go back to the comment we were talking about earlier, which is like running government as a business. Well, government's not a business. It's special and unique, and it needs to be treated that way. I am a taxpayer. I'm not an employee. I'm certainly not your stakeholder because I have no say-so in what you're investing in. And I don't like the idea of people who aren't elected, who actually are making decisions about where my money is going. Call them bureaucrats. They're very, very nice people because I really do like the folks that go ahead. I'm friends with them, for a long time. But
Yep.
it's just, is this the right system that we should be using to run our government? Is that the role of government, I guess is my question. Is it really for them to make the decisions? And they don't all work out. We've all seen examples go through our state where millions of dollars was flushed essentially because they weren't viable businesses and they didn't work out. I also know of some, existing businesses who have benefited from like lower interest loans and things like that. Less of a problem with that because they're already organically grown family businesses here that they're doing everything right and working hard. But I do kind of have a problem with large companies coming in who really don't bring a lot of high paying jobs with them. I really, really have a problem with what happened with a local food processor here, who one of the former employees that approved one of the sweet deals they got for $69 million ends up being an employee there. I mean, that just gives all of us a black eye. Did they follow the letter of the law? Yes, they did. That person waited a year before taking a job there. That's what the law says, but it still kind of smacks of something that's not right. We all can look at that situation and go, you know what, that's not right. It just isn't. So having free markets, having everybody have the opportunity that's, as equal as possible, I think seems to be a better way to operate a state. Just having things grow. Organic isn't necessarily the word for it because that's got the wrong connotation, but to kind of bootstrap things themselves. There are hundreds and thousands of businesses in South Dakota that start that way. And is it fair to them to use taxpayer dollars to bring in what could be ultimately a competitor for them? That doesn't seem right when these people have done it on their own and worked and were successful. And to spend our money that way, I think it's not right.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've said in peer, like, I'm pro agriculture, I'm pro business, I'm pro free market. Really, we just want less taxes and let us compete. I think the rest kind of sorts itself out in business. So that brings us to the legislative session that just wrapped up. There were really kind of two competing bills. The case of good versus bad. The first one was HB 10005 that was carried by Representative Rowe and Senator Crabtree, and that one proposed to give a 50-year tax exemption to these data centers versus the bill SB 135 carried by Speaker of the House John Hanson and Senator Chris Carr that was titled the Data Center Bill of Rights for Citizens, that seemed to focus more on, how do we bring data centers in without hurting the people of South Dakota. Can you talk a little bit about how those bills shook loose? You were actively involved in testifying and watching these bills and keeping all of us informed throughout the session. So give us a recap.
Sure. So HB 1005, that was the tax break one for 50 years, which is an absurdly long amount of time for this. And actually, when we were talking about what I was most concerned about, one of my chief concerns is the amount of investment it takes to bring a hyperscale data center in and the speed at which the technology is changing, because it is impossible to keep up with all of the changes that are happening. And there are efficiencies that are coming along. There are things that are occurring that might indicate that, it'd be like buying an obsolete Windows laptop to install this in your backyard, except it's costing you $10 billion. The technology is changing so quick. So the idea of 50 years worth of a tax break was crazy. I don't know where that number came from. Maybe some other states have done that. Don't know. But thankfully, everyone rallied around the idea that we don't want to give tax breaks to gajillionaires, and that in its simplest way to think about it is really not appropriate. And it did fail. So that one we were able to kill. The Bill of Rights for Citizens for data centers, that one actually succeeded. And that was such great news. And that should help protect us from electricity increase, the prices of electricity going up. And it's also going to make water reporting a necessary piece of it too. And so two of the chief concerns that we had talked about earlier are going to be part of that. And so that one passing was awesome. Great piece of legislation.
It's just reassuring that, we have some of these safeguards in place and trying to be proactive. And I think having the people of South Dakota be a part of the conversation. And yet it seems like data centers have become not only a hotbed topic just amongst the people of South Dakota, but we've also seen it on the debate stage on this governor's race. What have you kind of noticed just comparing, contrasting the candidates that are running for governor on this issue? I know we heard Dusty Johnson actually really sing the praises of the proposed data center over by Toronto. And it's just a darn shame, that it wasn't happening. And yet I've met the people of Toronto in Dual County that have been fighting tooth and nail because they don't see it as the right project for their community. I guess, what are you seeing in this race in regards to this, really hot button issue?
Well, I think it's going to obviously shake out in two camps. I'm pretty sure Dusty, I know what camp Dusty's in. I think Larry Roden's probably in that same camp, if I had to guess. John Hanson is more of a free market guy, and so he's not going to necessarily be in that camp. I don't see him as anti-data center. I'm not anti-data center. I think his running mate Carla isn't either, but they have to be done correctly. And I think a big piece of that is, do people want it in their community? Can we keep local control? Can we keep property rights, some of the first principles? Can we keep those front and center during this process? And I think that's really where the candidates shake out. Like, what's the role of the citizen, the local control role, and the property rights role? And frankly, the whether or not you give them a tax break role. So keeping a level playing field for our own entrepreneurs and our own businesses so they can thrive. That's where I think I see the Hanson-Lems camp. Toby Doden, I'm not sure where he is on that. I think he owns a crypto mining facility. Someone should check me on that, but that was my understanding. And so where that makes him go for hyperscale data centers, crypto mining can be very small. I don't know if you heard the story of the MIT students doing it in their dorm rooms, but those can be small facilities, nothing like necessarily a hyperscale. But I don't know where that puts him unless you have information that I don't have about that.
He doesn't have a voting record, so you don't really know. But I guess if we look at the two front runners right now in the race, Dusty versus John, like you said, it's pretty two distinct camps. So it's the more you know. And this show really is about educating people. And, final question before we wrap the show. You mentioned the phrase first principles. So my question is, can you kind of explain what that means and what your focus is when you look at projects like this or things that our government is focused on? What does first principles mean to you?
Really great question, and a great thing that I think about actually quite a bit. I'm not anti-AI and I'm not anti-data centers. And frankly, it's really hard to live in a modern world without using data centers of some form. But first principles would say, well, what am I actually concerned about that might come from a data center? Surveillance. I think Americans don't need to be surveilled. We need to live in a surveillance-free world. That's just part of your privacy is such an important and key first principle. We've got to respect that.
Absolutely.
And also part of privacy would be things like deep fakes, or especially porn deep fakes. What a nightmare, especially if you think about, it happens to, people that are high profile and that's horrible as well. But think about high school girls, junior high girls or boys, having these things happen to them and the availability of that. Is that actually what you want coming out of a building, literally coming out of a building that's in your community? I don't think most people want that. They don't want any part of fraud. They don't want any part of social scoring. They don't want to be part of ESG, which has kind of fallen apart now, thankfully. Those are things that are really first principle things that should be what we're fighting, I think. And it's easy to fight the monstrosity that you can see. And those data centers are big and visible, and they suck a lot of energy, and they take away from communities where they're at if you ask people who live next to them. But it's an easy target. But what we should really, I think, be concerned about and fighting is what's happening within those data centers, because very good things can come out of them as well. And if very good people are actually involved in this and roll up their sleeves and understand how this works and help move it forward in a way where it's safe and productive, then that's a different story than the definite dark side that can come out of it. And I think there's misinformation about it. The more that I use AI, at least in its current form, the less concerned I am about things like artificial superintelligence, because it still makes a lot of mistakes. Are there situations where even the people who develop it don't exactly know how it's doing what it's doing? We certainly hear those stories, and I think they're probably true. Is there a hype cycle around this that the AI companies put out there because they need to keep their stock prices artificially inflated? That's for sure happening. You definitely hear from a lot of leaders that are like, we are headed to an AI bubble. Don't know how bad it's going to be. Don't know when it's going to happen. It won't be the end of the world. There'll be light after it, just like there was with the internet bubble that came through. But that's a very real thing too. And so their inability to communicate like people instead of robots means that there's a lot of misinformation out there and scary stuff. If there's an MIT study that singled out South Dakota as being the prime target for job loss because we have so many administrative and financial jobs in our state. And for sure, that's really concentrated in Sioux Falls. That's a little bit scary. But again, it hasn't happened so far. The things that you want to react to, I just say, come back to your first principles. And those are the things that I think we should be actually actively trying to do something about.
I agree with you. And as I look at AI too, and especially like concerns for young people worrying about losing their job, I do a lot of mentorship with college and high school kids. And I tell them right now, AI is a tool that a lot of companies are using, and pretty much everyone is using. So be the person that knows how to use it. You can add a lot of value in any work setting that you're at. There's still going to have to be humans that implement these tools, but just the rate of everything is so much faster. But I also tell kids there's two things that AI can't replace and that we absolutely need as a society. Actually, I'll say three things. The first would be a work ethic. Human beings are still going to need to work. I think we're going to see a resurgence of a lot of tech jobs, of the manual things that, we were told in my generation, at least, that was just not, those weren't good jobs. And now you're going to see plumbing and electric and construction, and all those jobs become very, very valuable. The other thing I think is going to be irreplaceable is critical thinking skills and your ability to learn and to study and to see things online or in the news and to be able to discern, is this fake? Is this real? Is it propaganda? How is it being used to manipulate either my spending or my emotional reactions or my political leanings? So being able to think critically, which means getting off of our phones once in a while and reading a book or being outside or creating or doing something with your hands. The thing that makes us human, I think, is irreplaceable by the robots. And then the third thing, most importantly, is to have a prayerful, faithful life, because being able to live in a world that's modernizing at such a rapid rate, and someday, 100 years from now, we're going to look archaic to what our great grandkids are living in. But if that's your foundation, it doesn't matter what's happening in the world around you. You can stay grounded in what's good and right and true. I wanted to ask you one more question, because there's one kind of narrative I see that a lot of our politicians use, and they use it for a lot of different topics, but it seems to be that political alarmism. And so we hear over and over again that we are in a national security AI race against China. And so we have to rush to get these projects going. And anytime I feel like we're being rushed into something, I wonder, well, is there an agenda behind it? Is there a reason that they're pushing these so hard, so fast? Is China a real threat in an AI race, or is that just being used to kind of rush decisions?
So for the information that I can figure out, China has about a tenth of the data centers we have. We have got about 4,500. They've got about 450. Those are rough numbers. There are definitely ranges. The upper end of it would be we've got 5,200 and they've got 600. Their capacity is definitely different than ours are. So that would tell me that there's probably scaled differently than ours are, but they definitely don't have the data centers we have. They don't have the chips we have. They're hamstrung. NVIDIA is selling them chips, but they're selling them not an inferior chip, but they're selling them like a couple years ago model kind of a thing is what I understand. That doesn't mean they're not working hard on their end to make up that gap. But one of the things that China has done that is deeply troubling to me, they've made their models open source. And so those open source models are all over businesses in the United States because they're open source. They're free. You can make them your own. You can use them to button them down so you can get some security going with your data. I think that's a national security risk, and we've done nothing to curb that. And one thing I would say, not in defense of China, but one thing that they've had to do because they've had constraints, because they don't have enough data centers, is they've been more innovative in creating efficient models. So, is this propaganda that they're telling us? Who can say at this point? But right now, we don't have constraints. We just build more data centers. They're popping up. The people who want to build them in South Dakota are popping up everywhere. So if we start adding constraints to the data centers, which we are doing, people all over the United States, this isn't just South Dakota that feels this way. Everybody feels this. Virginia feels this way. Ohio feels this way. Texas feels this way. People are waking up and saying, wait a minute, I don't want something the size of Manhattan that's in these buildings. I don't want to live that way. I don't, I just don't want to be part of that. So we're starting to put constraints on data center developers. And I think that in a way will be good because it's going to force them to innovate, become more efficient. And there's experiments out there. If you go, you can read white papers on people who are researching and finding ways to make them more efficient and smaller. Those smaller data centers, if that's the trend, well, once again, you do not want to build a big behemoth that takes up a whole section of land next to a housing development in Sioux Falls or Brandon. So those types of things changing have been things I think that, we can't possibly know about China for sure, but they've definitely got, I think one of the national security risks is that. The other one is companion AI. And we really didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about the ins and outs of AI, but companion AI is, I think, an enormous problem. So think about people coming out of the pandemic that are lonely and isolated. We all know about them. The work from home thing did not help those people at all. So picture them finding, a companion with AI. And I can tell you of a 93-year-old man who's absolutely got one, and it's his writing partner. And when the internet goes out at his house, he's beside himself. So if it's happening to a former engineer who's 93, who's a writer, it's going to happen to vulnerable people. Right. So imagine the vulnerable people who happen to work at the CIA or the NSA or other 3-letter acronym government agencies who are using companion AIs, and we don't know where the LLMs are coming from. Right. We don't know. And there have been instances, right, of suicides where the AI did not talk the person out of suicide. It actually talked them into it, told them how to do it. Instances where murders have happened because of them, and it's starting to shake out in the court system. So picture that being part of something for someone who's actually making decisions in a national security level for us. That's a national security issue. So whether or not you can say China is a problem, China's always been a problem. Yes, that is true. If they control the flow of information in the future, that's a huge problem, right? Because that's who writes history. There is definitely a reality to this, but it's complicated. I'll just say that.
Well, maybe on that note, the real question to ask our politicians at every level is, what are we doing to put the right safeguards and protections in place to ensure humanity is on the right track and not just build as quickly as possible without thinking through some of these tangible things that really have an impact on the people, on the communities, and on the future of this country. Sarah, I appreciate all your insights as always, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I know when we had talked earlier, you had recommended a podcast. I had asked you yesterday, is there anything we could do to research, learn more? What was that podcast again that you recommended?
The All In podcast. So it's got a lot of the CEOs from the data center companies, or the AI companies more accurately. It's got David Sachs. He's part of the Trump administration. He's on there quite frequently. So you can get a window into what's happening and how the White House is thinking about what we should be doing. They're very excited about it. They love the idea of efficiency, which means people lose their jobs. So you got to kind of, keep in mind, I'm not recommending it because I'm on board with all this. But if you want to know what's actually happening in the industry, that's definitely the one to listen to.
Well, thank you so much for the deep dive today. And I hope you can come back on the show very soon.
Always great to see you.